Assalamu alaikum ji. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I would like to welcome you all to this first event that's being undertaken under the auspices of a new policy institute called the Institute of Development and Economic Alternatives. We're doing this event with a number of co-partners. This includes the Asia Research Center at the London School of Economics, the Center for Development Research at the University of Bonn, Lahore University of Management Sciences, the Institute of Business Administration at the University of Karachi, and of course the National Press Club where we are today. We are very pleased that the National Press Club agreed to hold the event here, particularly because we think journalists are a key constituent group and a key stakeholder in the discourse we need to have on tax. We're extremely honored to have Dr. Ehtisham Ahmad leading these series of weeks of events, which we're calling Tax Week, the Challenge to the Macroeconomic Solution and Devolution. Dr. Ehtisham Ahmad is currently a fellow at the Center of Economic Research at the University of Bonn and the Asia Research Center at the London School of Economics. I invite Dr. Ehtisham to start his presentation.
Assalamu alaikum. It's indeed a great pleasure to be here and speaking to colleagues from the press, some of whom are old friends. I have, as you know, been involved with the IMF program since its start in 2008 until my resignation at the end of 2009. I'm now, as Dr. Rihanna mentioned, at the London School of Economics, jointly at the University of Bonn. And the idea is to ratchet up our work on Pakistan. This is my personal research interest. It's also part of the research agenda, both of the Asian Research Center and the Center of Bonn. The idea really is to begin to look at key policy questions and key research issues and to disseminate and reach out to academics and policymakers in Pakistan, as the Asian Research Center has done in other countries in the region. There is an India Observatory also at the Asia Research Center. Mr. Manmohan Singh was a fellow of the center before he became Prime Minister. Much of the financing for that comes from the Reserve Bank of India. Unfortunately, the State Bank is not generous, so we don't yet have a Pakistan observatory, so that remains an objective. What I will talk about are 3 or 4 issues which are of interest to you and to us. And speak quite plainly, I am under no gag order by the IMF. I don't work for the IMF, I don't work for the government. I did leave, I resigned, as I mentioned, in 2009, my position as representative of the government at the IMF board. And when Hafiz Sheikh became finance minister, he asked me to come and help him. The tax reform, I left my assignment as advisor to the UAE Prime Minister to do so on a pro bono basis for a limited period of time. But that assignment is over, so I will not talk very plainly. I would like to engage particularly some misconceptions that people have, A, about the IMF program, B, our stability without an IMF program, and C, the issues related to the tax reform, and particularly what is actually involved with the current GST and why it's being reformed. Who are the gainers and losers, and particularly who are the gainers from the status quo. And I think that is something which has not been fully understood. The failures on the tax reform, I think, have come into sharp focus more recently with the flip-flop on the removal of the exemptions for the GST and the reinstatement of dreadful SRO on April Fool's Day. And I will talk a little bit about that. So Let's talk about the 2007 crisis and the 2008 IMF reform, and ask whether we are in a better position now than we were then, and are we facing a crisis? And if so, why? If it goes off, I'll just speak. I want to talk about the GST. When people talk about GST as if it's a new tax, it's been around since 1990. And in the last 10 years, it's been mutilated. And it's not been properly explained to lawmakers who are actually quite confused. Unfortunately, some of the people doing the explanation are also quite confused, so it's not surprising everyone is confused about the GST. So I'd like to say a few words as to what I think it should be. And who are the gainers from the status quo? It's a question that nobody asks. And what are the incentives for not fixing it? And who's benefited is not to fix it? I think those are questions that we need to ask. Not for the IMF, but for ourselves. And finally, I come up with a series of tax proposals. This tax week, so there will be a series of tax proposals, not just the GST, but looking at the whole range of taxes and really putting the case for efficient revenue generation, separate from efficient protection of the poor. And I think quite often people and countries and politicians try to do too much with each instrument and end up with nothing. So, is there a way out of the mess? And that's where I was thinking. Let's come back to 2007. In 2007, the then government didn't take action on prices. It held administered prices, and in doing so, it ran a major budget deficit. The balance of payments were under considerable pressure. The current account deficit was $2.5 billion a month, and reserves were beginning to hemorrhage. And yet, because the government said that we have reached the highest reserves in our history in October 2007, the government felt that it had a cushion and could afford to relax. I think it's important to think through what the strategy of reform was in this period. And I think the Musharraf period started well, but then got detracted. The origin of the reform actually goes back to 1990 and earlier, was to make Pakistan a more efficient place, a more attractive place to do business. And the reason that VAT was brought in, or the GST was brought in 1990, was to get rid of distortive sales taxes and excises that led to cascading. And when you have cascading, you really don't know what the net effect is on households, or on government, or on producers. But previously, I had been president of the Argentine Revenue Authority to come and provide a rescue plan for the FDI needed and endorse a very rapid reform of the FDI so as to be able to administer a value-added tax. And the idea was that we could do the modernization once again of the FDI in the 2-year period. Remember that internationally it takes countries only 3 years to set up a new administration from scratch, to do VAT. And here we've been at it for the last 20 years, the last 10 years, with $135 million from the World Bank, and have not managed to do anything. So the idea was that we would try and fix the FDR contingent on the value-added tax. This is the promise we made to the IMF. The IMF did not require anything else. This was our own promise and was the basis of the largest loan that we managed to get from the IMF. This is the document, you should read it. It's very interesting. But what's happened to our GST? As I said, the GST was managed by people who were corrupt according to Qamar Islam. And it was designed to replace a cascading system. But it was run like a cascading system throughout the 90s. With a cascading system, it's hard to tell the impact on households or on the poor. More importantly, it permits the tax administration to play games. Favor this person, harass that person, extract rents from a third person. That's the game with the SROs. And it's that facility of the FBR that leads to tax policy making by a tax administration without reference to Parliament. They're the ones who make policy. They're the ones who decide on the tax rates and who should be covered and who not. So the objective of the VAT reform was not revenues only, it was to make it possible to have an arm's length administration so that you know who pays what. So you know the effect on households, you know the effect on the poor, you know the effect on the rich, and you know the effect on industry and producers. That's the idea of VAT. That's why 140 countries have gone for a VAT around the world. It's not overly progressive, it's mildly progressive. And if there is an impact on the poor, it happens when you first introduce it, not when you fiddle around with a tax that's already been there 20 years. If the tax has been around for 20 years, there's already the impact on the poor has been taken care of. And improvements in the value-added tax would only reduce the burden on the poor, and that's something that people have not understood. I saw a statement by former Minister Qureshi saying that the value-added tax, the reform of the value-added tax will lead to a crushing burden on the poor. Well, what is he talking about? By fixing the GST, you will actually reduce prices. So why is there this fear that a reform GST or a value-added tax will lead to a burden on the poor? It will not. Indeed, if you do not do the tax reform, and you print $1 trillion every year and more next year, you build up an inflationary pressure that will crush the poor. So the inflation is guaranteed to crush the poor. The rich are, of course, hedged. So I find this argument that people make without thinking, without analysis, that the reform GST or a value-added tax is going to hurt the poor to be completely baseless. Where is the analysis? There isn't any. And indeed, the empirical analysis that has been made available or done by people in preparation for this suggested that in some cases, prices would come down. And this is what it would look like if you were to start from scratch. You can do a value-added tax in 3 years from scratch on a functional basis. And I draw your attention to functional basis. This was the core of the reform program. That has been reversed in the last couple of months. The functional program, the functional structure, unfortunately, audit in particular has been devolved to the person who does the tax collection. That's a big mistake. That's reversing the objectives of the entire TARP program, and is really, to me, a huge disappointment. Also, if you can implement a VAT from scratch in 3 years, why has it taken FBR 10 years and a $135 million project to get where you were in 1990 with lower revenues? It beats me, because in 1990, in the 90s, the tax GDP VAT GST ratio was 3.9%. It's now down to under 3. The efficiency of the GST was 0.39. It's now down to 0.26, which is the lowest in the world. So we have a record. We have the worst GST in the world. If we get to the efficiency of Sri Lanka, which is not great, we double the collection. It's as simple as that from the VAT. That's 4% of GDP. You do not get 4% of GDP from any other instrument in a non-distortionary manner. You can go back to taxing trade. You can go back to distorting wealth, which you can't actually tax very easily. You don't get close